Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back to lecture 2, and I'm glad you came back because today we're talking about the origins of sociology, and I love origins. You can always find out something about people when you know where they came from, right? Now, obviously, like any other discipline, we start with philosophy because people, of course, have been thinking about the world around them for many, many thousands of years. This isn't anything new. And so philosophy, which is the study of wisdom or the search for wisdom, has been doing this for a long time. They haven't always been right, but at least they've been trying. So one question, of course, has always been, what makes a good society? What is the nature of the good? And this usually comes down to people interacting with each other, right? Confucius, for example, he lived in the 5th century BC China, about 2,500 years ago. He talked quite a bit about the importance of social roles, specific social roles, the role of the leader, the role of the clerk, the role of the farmer. Now, of course, he dealt with this in an idealized way. He was talking about this is the good leader, the good ruler, the good farmer. So he wasn't really talking about reality. He was talking about more his perception of what is good. Very similar, Plato's Republic, which you may have heard of, based on the teachings of Socrates in the 4th century BC Greece. And he talked about the Republic as an ideal state where you would have 3 main classes. You would have just rulers, and for that you needed to know what justice means, and then you had to have faithful guardians, soldiers and policemen who would be faithful to the institutions of society. And also you needed honest producers, hard-working producers, right? People who would produce the goods of society without complaining all the time, I imagine. But no poets, because he felt poets just wasted time with frivolous games. So both Plato and Confucius were very idealistic. They were talking about ideals rather than reality. On the other hand, more of a social philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, he was a 14th century Arab philosopher, and some people think of him as the first sociologist because he actually wrote a history of society in which he looked at the reality of society, and he proposed an overall general social theory that history was secular between civilization and barbarians. So the basic idea was that civilizations would come together, and based on their strength, they would grow and create new ideas. But as they grew, they would kind of corrupt from within. The rulers would become wealthy, and the peasants, the people would stay poor or become poorer maybe. You would have corruption as officials took advantage of their positions. So these societies, even though they began powerful, would start to decay from inside. On the other hand, the barbarian societies on the outskirts of these civilizations would stay strong because they were rooted to the earth. Their leaders were close to the followers, so everybody felt a strong sense of bond. So at a certain point in time, the civilization would decay and the barbarians would pounce. And they would destroy or overtake or subsume that civilization. And then the cycle would repeat. The barbarians would become civilized, they would become the new rulers, and again, the circle would repeat itself throughout history. Now, during the Enlightenment, this is the period in Europe in the 17th century primarily, where philosophers started to question traditional ideals of society based on monarchy and religion. Particularly, philosophers like John Locke, Charles Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed theories of society or a better society based more upon concepts of political rights and popular will. So the idea that the king is the king started to be thrown aside. The idea that this state of society is mandated by God started to be questioned, and they said, well, maybe the people have something to say about that. Now, these ideas were still utopias in the sense that they were visions of a perfect society, not themselves necessarily based on actual study of social conditions. But there were forces of change in the world. The Industrial Revolution was occurring, and it was changing everything about the way people lived. Instead of living in the farms, masses of people were pushed off the farms and had to find work in the cities. There was vast wealth because of trade and industry, but grinding poverty for most of the human population, even worse than what they'd experienced before. Because on the farm, at least they could grow their own food. They could take care of their own needs for the most part. But now they were trapped in urban squalor. Crime was outrageous because everybody had to fight for whatever jobs were available. So the cities began to look like this: smog, chaos, pollution, and dirt. Women and children, of course, got jobs in the factories. Sometimes they were favored over men because they were cheap. Right? So instead of working in the home as a family unit, now they're working in a factory for people they never knew before. And the problem was, of course, the conditions were terrible. As you can see in this picture, children often got trapped in the machines. They would have accidents, and very often the factory owners would just throw them out and say, well, you're not getting paid now. At the same time, these conditions created social movements and revolution. And revolutions weren't like before when you had civil wars between wealthy groups. Now revolution pitted whole social classes against each other. And warfare became the work of entire nations. So now we had a world in which change was affecting individuals' lives. And this did create opportunities, but for most people, it created a lot of headaches. In fact, kings and religious leaders were quite losing their heads over it all. Right? They chopped off a lot of heads in the French Revolution. And so people started turning to science to say, okay, science is solving the problems of medicine, the understanding physics, the understanding biology. Can science help us to understand social forces? Right? So if you think of social power as a natural force, like gravity, right, then if we understand it, we can control it. So in fact, the first sociologists described themselves as social physicists. Right, that they were going to go out and understand the society and then come back and apply some kind of medicine or cure to the social problems that were around. Now, one of these people was a guy named Auguste Comte. He was a French sociologist. He was, in fact, the first person to talk about sociology as a field and argued for the scientific study of society. A lot of his motivation came from the chaos, or what he saw as the chaos of the French Revolution, which, as you can see, took place in 1789. He was born in 1798. So he was born and grew up in the aftermath of this very chaotic period that lasted about 30 years. Right? So his childhood would have been affected by this. And his family was aristocratic, so I'm sure he had some relatives who had, their heads chopped off. So he thought by applying science to the study of social issues, he could create a field called positivism. So positivism is the belief that sociology could lead to incremental increases in knowledge, just like in science, and create better solutions to social problems. He also thought of society as this three-stage. So in the ancient world, society was ruled by theocrats, by people who claimed to represent God. You couldn't challenge them because they would say, "Oh, you just sinned against God," and they would have your head chopped off, or they would crucify you. The next period, which is more the period of the Enlightenment, he called the metaphysic age, and this is the age of philosophers and age of reason and logic, which is good to a certain extent, but logic only gets you so far. The notion of science is not just using logic, but it's actually looking at reality. Right? So Aristotle ran around thinking that the heart was the source of all thought because he never actually checked to see what makes you think. Right? Of course, he didn't really have any way of doing that. So anyway. So another thing Auguste Comte said is, he said there are two types of facts. There are social statics. Static is what it sounds like, statistics. So static is something that stays in one place. It's static. It doesn't move. Right? So a social statistic would be something like, what is your age? Right? Now, if I ask you today what your age is, that is a statistic, and that statistic never changes. Right? Now, tomorrow, of course, you're a different age. Right? But that's another statistic. Right? So social statics is kind of like taking a picture of society at a particular time so we can understand how the pieces fit together. Right? And then social dynamics is the other type of fact. Social dynamics is how things change from one thing to another. Right? So, for example, your age, well, how does your age change? Well, I got older. Right? Once I was young, now I'm old. Right? That's not too complicated. But other types of changes are much more complicated. You might say, like, for example, France used to be a rural agrarian society, and now it's an industrial society. How did that change happen? Right? So we need to understand these processes of change and evolution in society. Another very important early figure in sociology was a woman named Harriet Martineau. And Harriet Martineau was a social reformer. She believed that it was important for the relatively well-to-do, she was upper middle class, to help those who were worse off. She was also a feminist and a very outspoken one. And she wrote a number of very important studies. She did a study wrote a book called Society in America, and based on that experience also a book about methods of studying values and norms, basically. Right? So some of the earliest notions in sociology were already being developed by her. I should also add that she had a very powerful influence on Charles Darwin. She almost married his brother, apparently. And Charles Darwin was trying to figure out this theory of evolution and why, when he went to the Galapagos Islands, these species, one species had diverged into many species. Right? And so Harriet Martineau introduced him to the work of Malthus. Right? And Malthus talked about how populations grow until they reach a limit. And this is where Charles Darwin got the idea of natural selection. That because these populations of birds and other species where you had one species, it could only do one thing, so it would be limited. But because the island was new, the species could break off. So if there was a new bird that could eat something else, that bird would be naturally selected for survival. Right? And suddenly instead of one species of bird, you had two, and then three, and then four, because the one species of bird would fill the whole ecological niche. Well, we'll talk about that later on. She also was one of the earliest sociologists thinking about religion, and again, many of our ideas about religion are precursors for later sociologists. She believed, for example, that when you looked at the history of religion, that early religions tend to be very concrete in their beliefs. So they believe God is a physical thing in a tree, in a rock, or that God is in the wind or in the thunder. So things that they could see, very concrete things, they thought these were gods. But later, as religion develops, God becomes more and more abstract. So God becomes the God of a tribe, or God becomes the God of a people, in the case of the Abrahamic God of the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, God becomes this amorphous, very abstract concept who's above society, above the world. Anyway, very interesting ideas. Now, just from here, talking about Comte and Martineau, we already see that some of the divisions in sociology that persist to this day. So Comte tended to be very conservative. He tended to not like radical change, right? So he wanted to keep change gradual so that you could keep a strong social structure. Right? Other sociologists, maybe like Martineau to a certain extent, believed that the problems we had were rooted in social inequality. It was the poverty of the poor that made them rebel. It was the fact that women didn't have any rights that created inequalities and injustice in society. So these needed radical change. Right? So on the one hand, people are saying slow down, and on the other hand, people are saying speed up. So by the earlier 20th century, we also had another perspective or divergence in perspectives emerging, because a lot of the early sociologists thought of society in terms of a big picture. And these are called macro-sociological theories. So the macro-sociological theories tend to look at society as a whole. They're looking down on society, and they tend to think of individuals kind of trapped or at most living within a given point in time in that society. Right? On the other hand, a new perspective emerged called micro-sociology, and these theories looked at society more from below. They looked more at individual or small-scale interaction in groups. So the opposite argument here was that people could create their own values and normative systems at the local level, and sometimes these would percolate up and create changes at the global level. So you think about chaos theory, for example, where a small change in one local area can have ripple effects and create massive changes around the world. Again, we will discuss all of these ramifications later. So macro-sociological theories, we already kind of gave you a clue. There are two main perspectives, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture. Functionalism, which is based on the work of Spencer and Durkheim, which we'll talk about next lecture. They focus more on the society and the social forces that keep society together. Right? So they think of society as an organism or a unit, and it has to be bound together for the common good. On the other hand, conflict theory, and this is based on the work of Karl Marx and Max Weber, who we will also be discussing in the next couple lectures, they focus much more on domination, that some people benefit more from the way society is. So it isn't the common good that society is protecting, it's the benefits and the domination of these specific groups of people. What side you tend to support, that's going to be up to you. Now, in the micro-sociological realm, we have social psychology. Social psychology, founded by George Herbert Mead. Again, we will be discussing this in a future lecture. They talk more about how people's thoughts and beliefs and behaviors are influenced by other people around them. Not just directly, but indirectly. So, for example, if I think you think I'm ugly, I will think I'm ugly, right? So it's based on what I think you think. We'll get into that. And then symbolic interactionism. Now this is another field founded by Herbert Blumer. And symbolic interactionism deals with how individuals create symbols. And symbols can be anything from language to objects. And in that process of creating symbols, they create the basis of values and normative action. And they do this at the local level, not at the macro level. Now, one thing that is, I think, very clear is that there are a lot of different perspectives, and some people might say this is confusing. Why can't you guys just make up your mind? You're just making us study harder. Well, it's not about that. The point is, by having different perspectives, we can understand the world in different ways, right? And partly that's going to be in debate. So people who support one position debating with people who support other positions. And partly it's just by applying the different perspectives and see what makes the best fit. Right? So I like to see this as not as a competition, but as a benefit. Something that, yes, there is competition, but that's good. Just like you don't want to have one store you have to go to, because then they can charge whatever price they like. If you have 2, 3 stores, you can take your pick, right? So we're going to come back to these perspectives much more in depth in the next couple lectures. And in the meantime, I hope you have a good day. Bye.